The lecture hall at Harvard buzzed with excitement. Hundreds of students leaned forward in their seats, their eyes glued to the stage where Professor Reginald Thorne stood, his sharp suit gleaming under the bright lights. He was famous for his brainy lectures on math, but today he was about to make a big mistake. At the back of the room, an old woman in a faded green coat sat quietly, her gray hair tied in a messy bun. She looked out of place among the young, eager students. Professor Thorne's eyes locked onto her, and a sly grin spread across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, pointing at the old woman, "it seems we have a guest who thinks she can keep up with my advanced calculus lecture." The crowd giggled nervously. "Tell me, madam, do you even know what a derivative is?" His voice dripped with mockery, and the students burst into laughter. The old woman's face stayed calm, her blue eyes twinkling with something nobody noticed confidence. She stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something else. "Professor," she said in a soft, steady voice, "why don't you give me a problem to solve? Let's see if I can keep up." The room went silent. Thorne's grin faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly, thinking this would be easy. He scribbled a monstrous equation on the board, one so complex it made the students gasp. "Solve this," he challenged, tossing her a piece of chalk. The old woman walked to the board, her steps slow but sure. The crowd whispered, some laughing, others curious. She stared at the equation, her eyes scanning the numbers and symbols like a codebreaker. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she began writing. Her chalk flew across the board, filling it with neat, precise steps. The students' jaws dropped. Thorne's smug smile vanished. In under a minute, she stepped back. The equation solved perfectly. The room exploded in gasps and whispers. Thorne's face turned red as he stammered, "That's impossible!" The old woman smiled gently and said, "Would you like another?" The crowd roared with cheers, but before Thorne could respond, she added, "Or perhaps you'd like to explain why your equation had a flaw." The hall fell dead, silent. A flaw in his work? Thorne's eyes widened in panic. Who was this woman? How did she know? And what was she about to reveal next? The story rewinds to 3 days earlier. In a small, cluttered apartment on the edge of Boston, the old woman, Clara Wren, sat at a rickety table covered with papers. Her walls were lined with books, some so old they were falling apart. Clara was 78, with wrinkles like a map of her long life, but her mind was sharper than ever. She wasn't rich or famous, but she loved math. It was her secret joy, her way of making sense of the world. She'd never gone to college life, hadn't given her that chance, but she taught herself everything, from algebra to quantum equations, using library books and old journals. Clara had heard about Professor Thorne's free public lecture at Harvard. She didn't care about his fame or his fancy degrees. She just wanted to hear about math, to feel the thrill of numbers dancing in her head. So she put on her old coat, grabbed a notebook, and took the bus to campus. She didn't expect trouble. She didn't expect to be noticed at all. But trouble was coming, and it started with a young student named Mia. Mia was one of Thorne's top students, always sitting in the front row, scribbling notes. But she was also curious, and when she saw Clara slip into the lecture hall, she wondered why an old woman would come to such a tough class. Mia whispered to her friend, "Who's that? She looks lost." Her friend shrugged, but Mia kept watching Clara, noticing how her eyes lit up when Thorne started talking about equations. Mia didn't know it yet, but she just spotted something special. Meanwhile, Professor Thorne was in a bad mood. He'd been working on a new math theory, one he thought would make him famous. But there was a problem: he couldn't solve one tiny part of it. It was driving him crazy. He didn't tell anyone, not even his students. He was too proud. So when he saw Clara in the back, looking so out of place, he thought, perfect. I'll distract everyone by making fun of her. He had no idea who he was picking on. As Clara sat in the lecture hall, she felt a flutter of excitement. She loved math, but she also knew people judged her. They saw an old woman and thought she was weak or confused. She was used to it. But today, something felt different. She could feel eyes on her Mia's curious stare, Thorn's sharp glance. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. And then Thorn called her out, and everything changed. What Clara didn't know was that her life was about to turn upside down. Thorn's equation wasn't just a random challenge, it was part of his secret theory, the one he couldn't crack. And Clara's solution wasn't just correct it, was about to expose something huge. As she stood at the board, chalk in hand, the crowd waiting, a single question hung in the air. What would happen when the truth came out? Clara stood at the chalkboard, her heart pounding, but her hand steady. The lecture hall was so quiet you could hear the squeak of her chalk. The students leaned forward, their eyes wide, waiting to see what she'd do next. Professor Thorne's face was a mix of shock and anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He hadn't expected this old woman to solve his equation, let alone hint that it had a flaw. A flaw! The word echoed in his mind, making his stomach twist. He was supposed to be the genius here, not her. But Clara wasn't done yet, and the truth was about to get closer. 3 days earlier, Clara had been flipping through her worn-out math books in her tiny apartment. She'd found an old journal article about a problem similar to the one Thorne was working on. It was a tricky puzzle about infinite series, the kind that could stump even the smartest mathematicians. Clara had spent hours on it, not because she wanted fame, but because it was fun. She loved chasing answers the way a kid loves chasing fireflies. That night, she'd scribbled a solution in her notebook, not knowing it would soon shake up a Harvard lecture hall. Back in the present, Clara turned to the board and started writing again. She didn't just point out the flaw in Thorne's equation, she began fixing it. Her chalk moved fast, drawing loops and lines that made the students gasp. Mia, the curious student in the front row, was scribbling notes like crazy, her eyes darting between Clara and the board. She whispered to her friend, "She's not just solving it, she's making it better." Her friend nodded, too stunned to speak. Clara's solution was elegant, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The crowd started to murmur, their voices rising with excitement. Thorne's face turned pale. He stepped forward, trying to take back control. "That's enough," he snapped. "This is my lecture, not yours." But the students weren't listening to him anymore. Their eyes were on Clara, who calmly set the chalk down and turned to face him. "Professor," she said softly, "your equation assumes the series converges too quickly. It doesn't. That's why it fails." The room erupted in whispers. Thorne's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. His theory, the one he'd spent years on, was crumbling in front of everyone. Mia, still watching from the front, felt a spark of awe. She'd always thought Thorne was unbeatable, but this old woman was outsmarting him without even trying. Mia pulled out her phone and started recording, her hands shaking with excitement. She didn't know why, but she felt like this moment was bigger than just a lecture. She was right. Across the room, other students were whispering, some pulling out their phones too. A few posted about it on X with hashtags like Harvard Shock and Math Genius. The moment was spreading, and Clara didn't even know it. But not everyone was happy. Thorne's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, stood near the stage, watching his boss unravel. Peter knew how much Thorne's theory meant to him. If Clara was right, it could ruin Thorne's reputation. Peter leaned toward Thorne and whispered, "We need to stop this. She's making you look bad." Thorne nodded, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't going down without a fight. He cleared his throat and said, "Very impressive, madam, but let's see if you can handle something harder." He scribbled a new equation on the board, one so wild it made the students groan. It was a trap, designed to trip her up. Clara looked at the new equation, her lips twitching into a tiny smile. She knew what Thorne was doing. He was trying to scare her off. But Clara wasn't scared. She'd faced harder problems in her little apartment with nobody watching. She picked up the chalk again, but before she could write, Thorne added, "And let's make it quick. We don't have all day." The crowd gasped. It was a low blow meant to rattle her. Clara's hand paused, and for a moment the room held its breath. Would she crack under the pressure? Back in her apartment 3 days ago, Clara had no idea she'd be standing here. She'd been sipping tea, humming to herself, happy in her quiet world of numbers. But now, she was in a battle she didn't ask for. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, including Mia's, who was still recording, her heart racing. Clara took a deep breath, her blue eyes sharp as ever. She started writing, her chalk scratching the board like a sword cutting through doubt. The equation was brutal, but Clara saw through it like glass. Line by line, she unraveled it, her solution flowing like a river. Thorne watched, his confidence fading. Peter whispered again, "She's too good. What do we do?" Thorne didn't answer. His mind was racing. Who was this woman? How did she know so much? And then a chilling thought hit him. What if she knew more than just math? What if she knew about the secret he'd been hiding, the one that could destroy his career? As Clara's chalk reached the final line, the room was electric with tension. She stepped back, the solution perfect, and turned to Thorne. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice calm but piercing. The crowd roared, but Thorne's face twisted with rage. He pointed at her and shouted, "This is a trick. You're not who you say you are." The accusation echoed through the hall, stunning everyone. Clara's eyes widened. What was he talking about? And what secret was he so afraid she'd uncover? The lecture hall was a storm of noisy students gasping, whispering, and tapping furiously on their phones as Professor Thorne's accusation hung in the air. "This is a trick. You're not who you say you are," he shouted, his finger jabbing toward Clara. Her calm face flickered with surprise, but she didn't flinch. The crowd's eyes darted between her and Thorne, the tension so thick it felt like the room might burst. Clara's heart raced. Not from fear, but from the puzzle of his words. What was he hiding? And why was he so desperate to make her look like a fraud? 3 days ago, Clara had been in her cozy apartment, unaware of the storm coming her way. She'd been reading an old math journal, her fingers tracing equations as she sipped her tea. One article caught her eye, a paper by a young Reginald Thorne, written years ago when he was just a student. It was brilliant, but something about it felt off. There was a tiny mistake, a hidden flaw in the logic that most people would miss. Clara had jotted it down in her notebook, not thinking much of it. She had no idea that flaw was the key to Thorne's secret, one he'd built his entire career on hiding. Back in the lecture hall, Clara stood tall, her green coat looking shabbier than ever under the bright lights. "I'm just Clara Wren," she said softly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I came to learn, not to fight." But Thorne wasn't listening. His face was red, his eyes wild. "You think you can waltz in here and ruin me?" he snapped. The students gasped again. Ruin him? What did that mean? Mia, still recording on her phone, zoomed in, her hands trembling. She sensed this was bigger than a math duel. Something was about to explode. Thorne stormed to the board, erasing Clara's perfect solution with angry swipes. "Let's try something no amateur could solve," he said, scribbling a new problem, a chaotic mess of integrals and variables that looked like a nightmare. The students groaned, knowing it was one of Thorne's infamous unsolvable challenges, the kind he used to scare off rivals. He turned to Clara, smirking. "Go ahead, genius. Solve it." The word genius dripped with sarcasm, but Clara's eyes sparkled. She saw the trap, but she also saw something else, a pattern, a clue buried in the numbers. It reminded her of that old paper she'd read, the one with the flaw. As Clara stepped to the board, Mia leaned forward, whispering to her friend, "She's not backing down." The friend nodded, eyes wide. Across the room, students were live tweeting, their posts blowing up on X with phrases like, "Old lady schools, Harvard prof," and "Who is Clara Wren?" The video Mia was recording had already been shared, racking up thousands of views. Clara didn't know it, but she was becoming a legend in real time. Clara's chalk moved like lightning, breaking down Thorne's impossible problem step by step. The crowd watched, mesmerized, as the board filled with her neat handwriting. But then, halfway through, Clara paused. Her eyes narrowed. She saw the same flaw from Thorne's old paper hidden in this new equation. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a cover-up. Thorne had built his famous theory on a lie, and this equation was proof. If she exposed it, his career would crumble. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the board. Should she call him out in front of everyone? Thorne saw her pause and pounced. "What's wrong? Can't handle it?" He taunted, his voice loud and cruel. The students shifted uncomfortably. Even Peter, Thorne's assistant, looked nervous, whispering, "Sir, maybe we should stop." But Thorne ignored him, too caught up in his need to win. Clara took a deep breath, her mind racing. She could finish the problem and expose the flaw, or she could walk away and let Thorne keep his pride. But as she looked at his smug face, she remembered all the times people had underestimated her, called her weak, old, unimportant. Something inside her snapped. She turned back to the board and wrote faster, her chalk flying. The crowd held its breath as she reached the final step. Instead of just solving the problem, she circled the flaw, tiny error in the logic that made Thorne's whole theory fall apart. "Here," she said, pointing to it. "This is where you went wrong, Professor. And it's the same mistake you made 20 years ago in your first paper." The room went dead silent. Thorne froze, his face pale as a ghost. The students erupted, some cheering, others shouting in shock. Mia's phone nearly slipped from her hands as she gasped, "She knows his secret!" Thorne staggered back, his voice shaking. You can't prove that." But Clara didn't need to say more. The board said it all. The flaw was clear, and the students were already piecing it together. Whispers filled the hall. Did she just destroy his theory? Is Thorne a fraud? Peter grabbed Thorne's arm, whispering, "We need to get out of here, now." But before they could move, a new voice cut through the noisy, a deep, commanding voice from the back of the hall. "Clara Wren, is that you?" Everyone turned, stunned, as a tall man in a suit stepped forward, his face shocked but smiling. Who was he? And how did he know Clara's name? The lecture hall froze as the tall man in the suit stepped forward, his voice echoing, "Clara Wren, is that you?" Every head turned, including Clara's. Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing her face, but she didn't speak. The man's gray hair and sharp eyes made him look important, maybe a professor or someone big in the math world. The students whispered, "Phone still recording," as Mia zoomed in, her heart pounding. Who was this guy? And how did he know Clara? Thorne, still reeling from Clara's exposure of his flaw, looked like he'd seen a ghost. His assistant Peter tugged at his arm, whispering, "We need to go now." But Thorne was rooted to the spot, his eyes darting between Clara and the newcomer. 3 days ago, Clara had been tidying her apartment when she found an old photo tucked in a book, a picture of her younger self with a man who looked strikingly like the one now standing in the lecture hall. His name was Dr. Elias Hart, a mathematician she'd met decades ago at a library. They'd spent hours talking about math, sharing ideas, until he moved away for a big job. Clara hadn't thought of him in years, but now here he was. Or was it him? She wasn't sure, and the uncertainty made her stomach twist. Back in the hall, Elias walked toward the stage, his face a mix of shock and joy. "Clara, I never thought I'd see you again, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The students gasped. Thorn's face twisted with panic. You know her? He stammered, his voice cracking. Elias nodded, his eyes locked on Clara. She was the smartest person I ever met, back when we were young. She could solve problems I couldn't even touch. The crowd murmured, stunned. Clara, the old woman in the faded coat, was no ordinary person. She had a past, and it was coming to light. Clara's mind raced. She remembered Elias praising her all those years ago, saying she could have been a star in math if she'd had the chance. But life had been hard, money was tight, and she'd worked odd jobs instead of going to college. Now, standing on this stage, she felt like that young woman again, full of fire. But why was Elias here? And why did Thorn look so scared? Elias turned to the crowd, his voice steady. Clara's mind is a gift. She sees things others miss. Like the flaw in your work, Reginald. Thorn flinched, his secret laid bare again. Thorn tried to laugh it off. This is ridiculous. She's nobody. But the students weren't buying it. Mia, still filming, caught every word. Her video now streaming to thousands on X. Posts were flying. Clara Wren is a math legend, and Thorn's done for. Elias stepped closer to Clara, lowering his voice. I read your notes back then, Clara. You found that flaw in Thorn's early work before anyone. I tried to tell people, but nobody listened. Clara's eyes widened. She'd shared her notes with Elias years ago, not knowing they'd matter now. Thorn overheard and snapped, You're lying, both of you. But his voice shook, and the crowd sensed his fear. Peter whispered urgently, Sir, we need to leave before this gets worse. But before Thorn could move, Elias dropped a bombshell. Clara, I work for the Math Institute now. We're reviewing Thorn's theory for a major award. Your discovery today changes everything. The room exploded in gasps. Clara's hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what was happening. Her quiet life was gone, and she was at the center of a storm. Thorn lunged forward, desperate. You can't prove anything, he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the crowd's cheers for Clara. Elias held up a hand, silencing the room. Clara, come with me. We need to talk about your future and his past. He shot a hard look at Thorn, who looked like he might collapse. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. She'd only wanted to enjoy a lecture, not start a war. But as she looked at Elias, then at the cheering students, she felt something new pride. She nodded, stepping toward Elias, but then Thorn did something shocking. He grabbed the chalkboard eraser and threw it at the board, screaming, This isn't over. The eraser hit the board with a crack, and a hidden note fell from behind Ida note with Clara's name on it. What was it, and how did it get there?